Hold on. So we are now live. Since there was no objection in time, I guess. All right, so I opened both of the quick ones. Which one do you want to do first?
Let's do the connection. If you scroll, I don't know how much you want me to reintroduce the issue, the API, or should I just jump straight to the questions from the last time?
Yeah, I think we can just open up the thing from, I think, so we did already 2 passes, right? So this was,
yeah.
Presumably this is the very last one we did.
Yeah.
Let me just quickly read what we said here. I think I remember this now.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, and then assumably this is your response to that?
Yeah, exactly. It's addressing, because we went in 2 parts over this issue. One was about the quick connection itself, and the other one was about the quick connection options. I put the answers to both your notes and questions in the one comment, and it addresses everything you just put in your notes. I don't know if you want to go through the details, like change in the proposal when we just changed it the way you suggested. I think what's left is the way we close dispose connection, or what's the lifetime behavior of connection, where we are leaning towards to letting it or leaving it as it is now, which for you to explicitly close the connection, you have to call close async. If you don't do it, then dispose async will silently close the connection. This is what we have now. This is what we had for the past 2 years. And we think it's okay because the API is like kind of niche or advanced. But since we're preview, we might change that in .NET 8 if we get a lot of or some feedback that people were using it like in await using and were hitting problems with closing the connection, or rather not closing the connection.
So the current expectation is dispose does close, right? Or no?
No, dispose doesn't do close because you have to provide custom error code for the close. So the dispose is closing the connection silently, which means it doesn't send anything to the peer.
So it's actually local cleanup, essentially, quick abort or.
Yeah. And the close async is like if you want to notify the peer about connection closure, you would call close async and provide your error code before you dispose the connection. The main comment was from Steve that like we have this pattern of using and of disposal, and that expecting users to know to explicitly call close async might lead to wrong usage of the connection because they would not expect it, since we are implementing iasync disposable, and they would expect dispose async to like do the proper closure of the connection.
Well, and on top of that, we've trained people that close and dispose are the same thing.
Yeah. I mean, or at least that dispose does a superset of close. Like usually you can I mean, there's some types where if you call close, you can call open again. Versus once you call dispose, the type is usually, done with, right? You can't longer do anything with the type. So it does seem weird to have a close async and also have dispose async and then effectively have written wrong code if the only thing you call is dispose async. I think that would be surprising.
I agree.
Okay.
Like it still seems
So
better.
the alternative.
I mean, so the other thing is, keep in mind, what do you want people to do? Would you want them to have a using statement and then below the using statement effectively have a try finally that does a close async? Because then you're effectively reinventing dispose async at that point.
Yeah, you're right.
I think in that case, we'll need a default error code. So basically,
Yeah.
when you call dispose without the close async with a specific code, we would fall back to the default. And that could work and basically fulfill all the desires. It just means we need one more property.
I think I would prefer that. I mean, especially when, like, I don't know how it works in your world, but like assuming the error code is, you know, vast majority of the type it's 0 anyway, then that seems like having the defaulted is fine. And then if somebody wants a custom error code, they just set it, right? If pretty much every time you close, you want a different error code, then I can see the property being error prone, but I would still think that's probably less error prone than just calling dispose and assuming that it closes implicitly, which now, you know, ungracefully kind of terminates the connection, which I think is more confusing than, you know, a zero error code.
And for the custom error codes, we can still leave the close async with a provided error code. So if somebody cares, they can do that. They would have a mechanism to do that nicely.
One thing they wouldn't be able to do with this is to intentionally silently close the connection. Basically abandon the connection from the peer's perspective.
Should we add API to do that? So in case of denial of service attacks, for example, it might be beneficial to say, hey, I'm bailing out. I just want to clean up my resources as quickly as possible, and basically be able to do that programmatically.
We could add a parameter to close async that would basically say silent, and we know inside connection that we've already called close, so we wouldn't invoke it again in dispose, so that would work. But we would have to add optional parameter to close async. That would be doable.
Or do it in the future and have some like
Yeah.
silent abort or bailout or whatever naming thing we choose to do.
Sorry, I think I didn't quite catch this suggestion. You're saying you would have a dispose async with an overload that has an error code? Is that what you're suggesting?
No.
So-
That we have close async overload or version of close async that would basically say do silent shutdown of the connection, and when you would call it, then the following dispose async would know that the connection was shut down silently and did not try to override it with the default connection close error code.
I see.
Or we have some form of explicit cleanup method, which basically just does the right thing and aborts silently.
To do it in this release or in this API suggestion. So if I get it right, you're leaning towards using default connection close code as part of quick connection options and not requiring close async to be called before dispose and have dispose behave correctly.
I would probably literally just have a exit code or error code property on the connection itself.
We're already passing the similar stuff for stream within the options. If you scroll down to the or up, I don't know where the definition of options is, maybe at the top of the issue.
Yeah, I know, I see the type. I mean, to me, the question is, I guess it depends on how you want to do this, right? To me, options are generally things that you know, can pool, right? You have one instance in this whole app and you do never change them, right? It's basically immutable. But it seems to me like something like an exit code or an error code is kind of like for particular connection, right? So like, would you really share this across everybody? Probably not, right?
I think you would, because your default, for instance, for HTTP 3 would be no error, and it would be for all the HTTP 3 connections.
I mean,
So it'd be
enough,
one per your application.
I mean, the default might, right? But how do you set the actual error code, right? Wouldn't you want a property on the connection for that?
No, we would still keep the close async. If you want different code for closure, you would call explicitly close async. If you want default behavior, you would just call this post async and the default code would be used.
Oh, I see what you're saying. Still seems weird because now basically, so that means if I actually want to do that, then I would still put a try finally around my code and then in the finally would call close async, no? Or
let's assume that you want to call close async with some different with some different close code. In most cases, it would be in exceptional cases. So we would have try, catch, exception 1, and then close with one error, catch, exception 2, and then close with another error, and so and so and so. And this whole thing would be inside the using await. And when it would come to this post, it would know that close async was already called, so it would not call it itself.
right.
Yeah, so basically, close async would be set the exit code and then call dispose.
Right. I guess that works. I mean, to me, I mean, the benefit, I guess, from calling close async is you can funnel in a cancellation token for the closing, but
Yeah.
that does work. So basically, then the only API change would be you would have a default error code on the connection options that would not be required, right? That would be a regular long, I guess, default error code get set, right?
No, it has to be required. Default, it's in the, another option is to add default connection close code. And it has to be required because in case you do not call close async or do not provide any close code, what we would use. If we don't have any close code, we have to do the silent, which is the thing you don't want us to do.
I mean, can't you pick a value like, I don't know, -1,
No.
0?
No, it's not possible. This like the space for error codes in Quic is always at the application layer.
I mean, keep in mind, everything you make required, everybody has to write, right? So like
Yes.
the more things
Yes.
you add there, the more
Yes.
annoying it gets.
Yeah, that's,
I think
and
it's probably a property of Quic to be annoying.
I said if the alternative is you have to call close async and pass the value anyway,
yeah.
both options we're discussing force you to specify it.
Yeah, I mean, this is still better than, forgetting to call close async because nothing tells you need to do it. So in that sense, it's better. Like, I guess the only thing I would say is like if the only thing we try to avoid is a silent error, like it seems also acceptable to say like you just set some default error and then you say, all right, if you want something else, you need to call close async yourself, right? But at least then you don't have a silent issue,
Yes.
right?
Yes.
So in that sense, I think it would also be acceptable to say you can't configure the default. We just pick one for you, and then if you want something else, you call close async, right? We just avoid the silent behavior.
No, we cannot pick any code for the user because, for instance, if we pick 0, it might mean no error in HTTP3, but it might mean everything is bad in different protocol.
That's still okay, right? They can choose whatever they need to per application. So we would still gotta force them to do that if they want to choose something else.
Yeah, I mean, I guess my argument is you don't have to pick a perfect one. You just have to pick one that at least gives them an indication that something bad happened and they have to do something, right? The problem with like not having anything where they just forget to call close async, you know, it looks like everything is fine, but then stuff just times out and they have no indication what went wrong, right? It's a bit like saying, like, you know, if we don't know anything better, we just say HTTP 500 when you have an unhandled exception. Is that the best HTTP error code? Probably not, but at least it's better than 200, right? So it's you just pick one that is in the vicinity of like your code is broken, so do something better than that, right? That was the only reason why I said like pick one that is not indicating of something else. And if you legit can't because there's like 500 different things to choose from and they're all very specific, then maybe it's okay to require it. But yeah.
Yeah, I think that when I answered that, I might have misinterpreted your previous sentence. The goal is just that it has to be always the user code that picks the connection close code. It can never be systemnet Quic.
Well, that's what Nick wants us to do, right? And what the spec alludes to, I'd say as long as we give decent option to users to choose whatever they want to, we can still choose 0 or -1 and get away with it. It wouldn't be perfect, as Imo said. And again, that's not what Nick wants us to do, but we could.
And what was wrong with allowing the default to be specified on the connection options?
I guess there's nothing
Which
wrong
again
with it.
would be 0 or -1 as the default, but then somebody can specify it for what seems reasonable for their application. I would guess most things are going to use 0 as no error because that's fairly consistent. So 0 seems like a reasonable thing to me, unless we always want someone to specify it, in which case, you know.
Right. And you can write documentation about good behavior about saying, yes, write one, right? Or provide one for your application so we can have guidance to do the right thing.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I have no context in Quic, right? Just from HTTP standpoint, like I'd be surprised if I knew of HTTP client and it says like, what's your default error code? I would be like, well, just unless I tell you something, just, I don't know, pick HTTP 500, right? But yeah, I mean, like but yeah, that highly depends on the domain, I guess. So would this thing then go on the Quic connection options or the client or server options?
The base one, the Quic connection options.
So then basically what we have said right now is this. So we basically leave Quic connection as is. We leave the error code on it. Then we have default error code on this guy here.
Could this be named default connection close code? So first of all, we know that's our default close code.
I mean, you can name whatever you want, I guess. It's just I just want that these guys somehow have some correlation, I guess. So if you call this one default close code, then it's a bit weird that this is called error code. So whatever you decide, I would just somehow align them.
Okay.
But close error code would work, right? Then you basically have it's the close methods error code, right? I mean.
Yeah, I think throwing the close in there and default close error code is descriptive.
Yep, sorry about that. So here we go, default close error code. So that means on the client you have 4 required properties, on the server you have 3. I think that's reasonable. Have you used required anywhere else before, or is that the first time you use required in an API?
For me, this is certainly the first time. I don't know if we have it anywhere else. I don't think system.net anything has required use.
I'm pretty sure this is the first and only.
Because I don't think we've ever used it because either net standard or some other complication usually creeps in.
I mean, it
We
literally
definitely talked about
it literally just got added to the compiler like 2 weeks ago. So
Okay.
Oh, okay.
So so that was another question. So it has
just
landed
started
4.7.
trying to use it in ASP.NET.
yes,
I would still say, can we leave it out and maybe add it if we need to?
add the required.
Yeah, I'm not sure if we are at point
That would be a
we-
breaking change.
Yeah. Oh, I was just thinking if we want to be the guinea pig at this point of stage, of this game
Well,
for something which
Yeah,
is
the-
brand new and never used, just scares me.
The alternative
question
would
for
be
me
to
would
make it a
be, like,
constructor parameter.
On
Right.
client authentication options, making the property required doesn't actually suffice, right? Because just setting that to a new instance, it still lacks sufficient details for it to actually work, right? There are properties you have to configure on that instance.
Right.
So just satisfying the required there isn't in and of itself sufficient to meet the contract, which brings into question whether required is actually worthwhile.
Well,
Right.
it was suggestion from the API review process. That's why I worked it in places where it made sense.
Yeah, I think I had
Indeed.
suggested actually, talking
Yeah.
with Fred to see whether it would be sufficient, but I'm not sure it is.
So what else do you need to specify?
I summarized in my reply that we're basically using required for required properties, and where it is not sufficient, we are validating in the listen async or connect async methods and throwing appropriate exceptions from them. So at this point, the required is to navigate the user toward success, more success than failure. But it's
Okay.
not
Oh, I see.
completely foolproof.
I mean, basically, it just means you need to pass in client authentication options. We have no way of validating the client authentication options, beyond that you initialized it, right? So you can still set it to null, and then, that will be okay, but then we would fail later, right? So I guess that seems fine in my opinion, because at least you give the user an indication, okay, I expect you to give me client options, and then, or whether they are valid or not, it's the same kind of a parameter, right? Like you say, I want one, and then you can pass in one, and then whether that's valid or not, that happens when you actually execute the code, right? So in that sense, it's not really any different from a constructor.
Another approach would be to forgo required in all places and just do the validation in the connect async listen async, like basically the entrance method to system.net Quic. So you would get all the errors from a single point of usage, basically. I don't know if that's
I mean, the
better
idiomatic
or not.
way to convert this tie would be to just make them constructor arguments. That would be the most straightforward way, right? You would just say quick client connection options in the constructor takes client authentication options and remote endpoint and default stream error code and default close error code, right? That would be, and then server would just be server authentication options, default stream error code and default close error code, right? And then that would be the straightforward translation from that. You can also say we don't do that. It's just all get set, and then you just do the validation very late in the game. We have done that too. Usability studies seem to indicate that that's okay, so long your exception messages are actionable, right? So long you say, hey, you didn't configure this property correctly on the options, please give me an XYZ, or make sure XYZ and ABC are consistent or something to that extent. That's also fine. I think it's not a biggie. I mean, in a sense, when you go down that path, breaking changes are less visible in the API, right? If you decide that now you need to pass in something else and the property was always there, but now you're enforcing it, that's not visible in the API. That's a behavior breaking change that is only in the implementation, right? With a constructor-based approach, at least you see there's an overload that takes it now. Or somebody tried to add it to the existing constructor, and that's clearly an API breaking change. So like it's a bit more, I guess, amendable to preventing accidental, breaking changes, I guess.
But since we are a preview feature, we could change our mind in the next release.
Yes, you could. Yes, you could.
So maybe we're actually like a good guinea pig to try this out. And if it doesn't work out, we can just remove it in the next release and go with the validation way and constructors.
Yeah, to my knowledge, required is only supported by C# though, right? Is that right, Steven?
Currently, yes.
So what's the experience when I use VB or F#? It just doesn't validate anything?
I don't know if there's a mod rec or what happens.
Yeah, that's kind of unfortunate.
Well, I mean, if there's a mod rec, then unless we're saying we never care about VB again, then it's now a forbidden feature in .NET Runtime.
Yeah, but where would the mod rec be, right? Because if the mod rec is on the property, that means you can just new up the type, and then that would be okay. But now there's no enforcement that you initialize those properties, right?
And in fact, you wouldn't be able to, because
Exactly.
it would see the mod rec applying to the property, and then VB would say, I'm not allowed to call this for reasons I don't understand.
So the only way to make the code compile is to know that it will fail at runtime, which kind of seems, I guess, one step backward and 3 forward or something. No, the other way around, right?
Yeah. If it's a mod opt, then VB would just ignore it and not know that you need to set it. And you'd still have to have the validation code for VB and F#. So.
All right, so maybe we should not use it then.
So we reach consensus.
It sounds like plate-bound validation only.
That'd be nice, I think, personally.
Not even the constructors?
I mean, if you can do it in the constructors, I think that would be fine too. If you need more information, that you only have available when the connection happens, then I think that's also fine. Like I think in general, like when you have this pattern where you have an options type, most of the time, like for example, whether you can't validate the local endpoint anyway, right? Like the only way to validate the endpoint is to actually bind to it and see whether the port is available, right? So that will only happen when you actually connect anyway, right? So there's always going to be some validation that needs to happen at runtime. So might as well move all of that to that point.
I want to cry now. Okay. Let's forgo the required. So we're back to the original suggestion for the options that was in the original API issue.
That's fine, right? That's fine, Manya.
Yeah, I
You
know.
don't even need to do it in the PR you have pending, right? We can still
Yeah.
add the validation later. It's about the surface.
No, sorry, Thomas, we have to do it because the moment the ASP.NET Core is gonna consume this, they're gonna hit tons of errors because of the required keyword. And if we remove it now, it's like, the same way we had it in tests. We were setting the properties like one by one, and I had to change all the test code because of these changes. So
You can still keep it, right? The test code. You can still set it in constructor. That's not a problem. It just won't be required.
Yeah.
Anyway, that's irrelevant for this discussion. Let's forget the required.
Agreed.
Yeah. And we will reach the consensus afterwards.
So we done?
No.
Well, on connection we are, no?
Are all the comments resolved? Quick connection options. One thing that was also controversial, and Steve pointed out in my PR, was that the default value for idle timeout, we chose time span 0, which is kinda weird. And the time span 0 means that we're gonna let the underlying implementation to choose the proper timeout. -1 is infinite, 0 is choose for yourself, and anything bigger than 0 is you're specifying the timeout.
And I called it out just because in other places we have timeouts, 0 means immediate.
I feel that there are places that 0 means I don't have an opinion.
With
X509.
timeouts.
Yeah, I think X509 chain has that. It may be the only other place, but that my recollection is 0 is sort of I don't have an opinion.
I mean, is a 0 timeout useful?
No, it doesn't make sense.
Yeah, I was mostly asking Stephen for the other places where that means immediate timeout. Is that just because, well, the straightforward interpretation of the value, or is there actually a scenario for that?
So there's sort of two answers to that. One is in things like timer, it means immediate because you might be creating it using math, and so you're counting down. You're recreating a new timer with the remaining time, and you end up with 0, and so that basically means okay, the time has expired immediately. But even in something like networking, in like sockets HTTP handlers connection pool for HTTP 1.1, you can set an idle timeout to 0, which basically means the moment you try and return the connection to the pool, it'll be disposed. So it's a way of basically saying disable pooling.
Interesting.
Yeah, I guess the definite or X509 chain policy URL retrieval timeouts has a value of 0 means there is no limit, which means the OS picks a limit for you.
It might be actually similar for sockets as well. So we might not set a timeout, but on TCP, TOS also has a bunch of timeouts, and we just don't fiddle with them. So I think that might be okay.
And we get this precedent for it, fine. I just wanted to call it out because the places that I'm aware of it has a different meaning.
So what is the downside of just marking the property as nullable and say the default value is null?
It's ugly.
You still have to decide what 0 means.
Yeah. And we don't have a good meaning for 0.
I mean, I
We
guess
would
it means the same
probably-
as epsilon above 0, but
Yeah, it just means it will time out very quickly.
No,
Yeah.
like we couldn't use the 0 because how MS-Quic behaves when you set to MS-Quic 0, it means infinite. Sorry. So we cannot actually pass the 0 to MS-Quic.
But you could pass 0.00000001.
Oh yeah, I could.
yeah, or you could just immediately return, yep, it's already timed out. 0 time has already elapsed.
Yeah, you could handle it on the managed side. I guess that's true.
Because you'll have to handle negative time spans already, so just changing your less than to less than or equal and immediately fail would... I mean, unless you do all negative numbers are infinite.
I'm the only one who thinks it's inconsistent. We can leave it and move on. I don't want us to bend over backwards to do one.
Yeah, I feel like it's a case where we're consistently inconsistent. Which is not what we like, but...
Yeah, I guess. Right, so then we leave the timeout as is, I guess. I think this is all the things we talked about, right? So we talked about this, we talked about this, we talked about this. We did talk about this. This one you just took the suggestion, so there's not much to talk about, I guess. Are we then good with this? Or is there anything else we need to consider?
I think we are good to go.
You just don't want us to make changes anymore, right? That's okay. You're in preview. There's plenty of room for us to make changes to it. All right. Next one. Quick stream. I think did we review this ever? We did.
Yeah, we did.
And then here's your response. So let me quickly read this to remind myself what we looked at. Yeah, that looks familiar. All right. So now, here we go. Do you have an API shape? No, you just okay. You just changed it to ID. Okay, I have to do this here myself, I guess. Or do you have an updated API proposal here? You have an updated API proposal here, right?
Yeah, I've updated. Yeah.
Sweet. All right then.
So the stream was mostly about naming, right, Vanya?
Yep. This should be faster, hopefully.
Don't jinx it. Okay. So, do we have a naming convention for what we call task-based properties?
I noticed that on channel we have completion, I think, task property.
Yeah, it's just the same as what we have in data flow.
Because reads closed, writes closed is a bit odd, because to me that kind of almost implies like it's an int. It's like a number of reads closed.
Yeah,
that's closed.
Manya changed this away from completion at my request because it's confusing. I was very against the fact that we have this complete writes thing that doesn't actually cause writes completion to complete. Or writes completed or whatever it was called.
So I'm not sure I understand. Are you saying that you prefer the current proposed naming here, or you would like?
I prefer closed. I prefer closed to completed. I understand the objection, but
right.
I prefer closed to completed because you call complete writes, and then this thing that was called writes completed might not actually complete.
So I assume the scenario for exposing the task is so I can say await it's stream dot reads closed.
Yes.
Why doesn't complete writes return a task? Or can you explain that behavior, Steve?
Manya will have to. I think because
Sorry, this is like a big rehash.
I think she's doing it because of your code.
The thing is that
maybe? Sorry.
The thing is that complete writes behaves the same way the pool complete writes parameter in write async. It basically tells the Quic that this is the last operation on the right side. We're done with it. We're not going to write anymore. And then, like underneath, the MS Quic implementation or whatever implementation exchanges frames that we're closing the write side. On the other side, but you can have a raise condition. And on the other side, the peer at the same time might say, abort my reading side, which basically means for you, abort your writing side. And somewhere underneath, the MS Quic will solve this raise issue and will decide what's going to be surfaced. So the question would be, if complete writes were to be async, what would the task mean? And like, would we be waiting for, would we be closing this as well with the aborts or not? Or would we, I don't know, it's just, from my perspective, it's, I don't know.
So
And
I get,
only-
like, because of the write behind buffer, the complete write's true to write async means that the value task return from write async might complete before the write is fully transmitted. It sounds like there's an analogy to that. Yeah.
Yeah.
Naively, I would think you can just return the writes closed task from complete writes still, but maybe there's reasons not to.
I think, Manya, can I try and restate what you told me, which is, so my understanding is what's currently called writes closed and what's called writes completed is actually waiting for a response from the server to basically acknowledge the completion, and that acknowledgement might be success, or it might actually be, no, this was actually aborted. And so the question is, if that needs to be behavior, if writes closed needs to wait for that round trip, then would you really want, do you want complete writes to wait for that round trip as well? And if yes, do you want write async with complete writes true to wait for that round trip as well? And I don't know the answer to those questions.
Honestly, in Kestrel, I don't think we need it. Like, with sockets we call shutdown, I don't think that's like blocking on like a graceful shutdown from the client. Certainly not in all cases. It just, right, waits for the syscall. But anyway. Yeah, I see in the comments that this was renamed from shutdown, which,
Yeah.
honestly, that almost seems like a better name, but maybe that's because like I'm coming from sockets.
Yeah, why are these tasks and not just like a wait handle?
Why would you want a wait handle?
I mean, a task property seems really weird.
You need to be able to await something. You don't want to use a wait handle.
I guess.
But whether it's a property or something returned from complete writes, which would be complete writes async or whatever, or that's a different question. But you need something to await.
Because if the flow is you call complete writes and then await writes closed, then that seems like it should just be the return of complete writes. And if nobody else is ever going to look at it, then it's the return value.
My understanding, and Manya can clarify, but my understanding is these were separated because ASP.NET immediately calls await writes closed.
Yeah.
And then does other stuff concurrently.
Yeah. They need to be able to get the task without triggering the operation closing the write side.
Right. So
that
is that the scenario is that one operation is waiting for some other thing to get around to closing, where it makes more sense. But then that's where it seemed like really it's just a wait handle at that point, possibly with Fred's question of do we have a task from wait handle built in?
We do not want to use wait handle here. There is a way to get a task from a wait handle, but all that's doing is queuing work to the thread pool that blocks on that wait handle and then signals the task when that blocking completes. Okay. Wait handles are synchronous.
Versus here where you're making basically a custom waiter that just only fires once you call it.
Right, this is a callback that completes the task, which you await. Yeah.
And it's just as you described.
Stefan?
Sorry, yeah. Can you remind me what happens if you dispose the stream before writes closed is completed?
If you dispose the stream, the disposal will attempt to gracefully complete your write side. This is because we want to be able to use the stream in non-quick stream way correctly, like that you can pass it around as a stream and still use like using stream, read, write, and don't do anything quick specific and have it behave correctly. So the dispose will do the graceful completion of write side for you.
All right, thanks. I was just curious.
Thomas, you were next.
I was about to say, to follow up on Jeremy's question, I think. So there are actually multiple things. So you can either do the nice shutdown or you can get aborted shutdown from a peer. And this allows you to handle both cases with a single wait token. So if we get abort from the other side, or if we do the nice thing, then it's basically single object to wait for. And in the past, I think it was Steve's objection, we had things which were similarly named, but they actually did something slightly different. And that's, I think, where the confusion was coming from. And that's why we decided, or we proposing to change the name so it's kind of distinct and more definitive to avoid, the confusion of similarities or similar names.
Yeah, I mean, for me, it's really just, somebody mentioned channels, so I went and looked and saw that, yes, there is one on channels, but a task returning property and then the usage patterns around that, just, it felt new to me, and if not new, because clearly channels has it, that it's rare enough that it threw me. But if it makes sense to people who use asynchronous code, then I guess it's kind of weird that there's this ambient state floating around in the shape of a task to me.
It's just an arbitrary thing that allows you to, you were suggesting it should be a wait handle. If it was a wait handle, it would be stream.readsClosed.wait1. And instead this is a wait stream.readsClosed.
Yeah.
So it's just a different type to support the consumption pattern that's desired.
It's also not mandatory for basic usage, so you can still open a stream, write close to it, and say, "Trada, I'm done." It's more for the advanced users who wants to coordinate more things together and do fancy stuff.
Yeah. So for reads closed, which I assume has maybe some similar, somebody wants to await and do some things after, but it feels like if you're wanting to do like more work, you would then do what's kind of rare, and you'd be like, if not reads closed is completed, and then maybe now you await read, or maybe you just wouldn't do that check. It just, knowing what reads closed is used for feels, also weird to me. But if it makes sense, I guess it makes sense. I'll stop talking.
Back to the beginning of the discussion, my biggest objection was that the verb in complete writes and in write async complete writes matched the term used in the properties, but meant something different. So as long as those things are different, if we're gonna keep the shape that's on the screen, as long as those things are different, I'm okay with it. I'd be fine if we renamed the properties back to read writes completed, if we change the methods to shutdown writes and bool shutdown writes, just as long as it's a different thing. Because when they're the same, it suggests that one causes the other, and that's not true.
Another alternative to complete writes was to actually get rid of it, and you could use write async with empty buffer and complete writes or shutdown writes set to true, and that would do exactly the same thing. It would just return immediately finished value task, because that task is kind of tied to the write operation, and the write operation would not happen, so it would be completed immediately. I don't know if I'm expressing myself well, because I see the confusion on Jeremy.
Oh, no, I was also reading chat. No, I'm like, yeah, if we think that there's low value in the method being standalone, then, you know, or we rename complete to close, or, you know, whatever. I guess right now naming it close would be bad because then it would match. And I was just trying to figure out what the peer prefix was going to go on. No, so yeah, don't read any confusion out of me.
So with consensus, I leave it as proposed because it's as good as any other option because it's different.
So I guess I will, from Frederick's comment of a peer prefix, is reads close, are the reads and writes the terms here as applying to the perspective of the person using them, or are they opposite?
They correlate with can read, can write. You can look at them this way.
Okay, so it's the opposite of, so reads closed is peer writes closed, and writes closed is the peer now thinks that their reads are closed. Okay.
Yes.
So putting a peer prefix would require inverting their meaning. So
yes, and that's why I was strongly against that.
Yeah, so I think they're reasonable as is, because it's the which side do you think you're doing, and you're asking, is that viable? So
would it make sense to make these properties value tasks so they could theoretically be settable, since streams can be pretty short-lived?
I can do that. It's possible from the implementation perspective. Whether it's practical, that's another question.
I think that
I have some concerns with that.
Yeah.
As properties, that means we're basically providing a pattern to get multiple copies of the same value task, which leads you to use the same value task multiple times, which is explicitly not supported.
Well,
Could
the
we,
implementation.
Oh, sorry.
The implementation would each get, it would give you like a new value task extract. Back
Right, but at that point, why use value task?
That's maybe a question.
If you only access it once per stream, you could align an allocation, right? Like based on the usage pattern, you might have to fall back to allocating on the second get or something.
If you had some other, I mean, as an implementation detail, if you had some other object that you could implement iValue task source on, or, well, yeah, if you had some other object that you could implement iValue task source on, or you could somehow pool them and that was relevant, then yeah.
I know
you can guarantee they'd only be used once. Yes.
My only reason for this feedback is like we are on the per stream path pretty because that's like a per request path in ASP.NET. Like that's when we start caring about like single object allocations and stuff like that.
Are these, I mean, how heavyweight is QuickStream?
I assume fairly.
The textual layer, like our wrapper of QuickStream, we pool heavily for this reason.
But you don't pool the QuickStream itself.
That's not ours to pool. Yeah, I haven't looked.
At the moment, that's not possible. The QuickStream, as you see it here, is not prepared to be reset and reused. But we have an open issue for that. For future.
I mean,
yeah,
especially if it was really important to make the return of reads closed and writes closed a value task, and we had reason to believe we could reasonably avoid the allocation for those, either via pooling or something else, then we could do that, but they can't be properties. And the implementation would need to take on the cost of either it would returning value task, but under the covers it would just return a new, value task wrapping a task, or if it was actually used doing some sort of pooling thing, it would have to basically guarantee the semantics that, you know, every time you call it, you're effectively getting a different one and need to support that. So it couldn't hand out the same underlying I-value test source each time.
Yeah,
Yeah,
I think that as properties, it basically permanently precludes ever being a value task. And we would need a complete redesign to figure out how to make that work.
well, I guess this is preview, so we can always go back and change it. Yeah, I just know like yesterday in triage, James, we were looking at an alternative to the connection close cancellation token that like saves allocating registrations and stuff for exactly this reason, because we're now like starting to use it per request.
I mean, if you have already a task for future to find how to basically reuse the streams if you need to, maybe this could be lumped together and just move it to the 8th, and if you can find better pattern how to avoid allocations. I think unfortunately the Quic is rather complicated. So you have the connection, you have streams inside of that, and there's some relations. So it's not as easy as a TCP.
So ship it.
This is all preview, right?
That's the plan.
So what's the conclusion then in terms of API shape?
Ship it.
Looks good as proposed.
For now, growth mindset.
Yeah.
All right. You were right. This was faster than the last one.
Since Timo or Jeremy is typing, I can't see who's that. There was the detour we bumped today. Jeremy and Steve, do you guys want to talk about the naming proposal changes? There was API which was proposed last time for some crypto stuff, and there were two concerns raised about did we choose the right name, and it hopefully should be a quick discussion. So I was hoping if you can, Jeremy or Steve, bring it up.
I'm looking for the issue number. Apparently I closed the tab.
My auto-completion is only mildly embarrassing today.
Oh no, there it is.
Which one is it?
So the API issue was 711901. 71191, not 09.
Oh.
So basically on Thursday, we just kind of smashed the approve button and went to lunch. So there was, so Steve had asked the question of the naming of validation policy, and through some discussion in the PR, I threw up, or several straw men were thrown up, and the last one that I saw was we had suggesting to rename it to chain policy or certificate chain policy. The certificate would be because matching a pattern that we did for how the revocation property works. And then after our meeting, someone had commented on X509 chain policy that verification time ignored, that they think that conveys a meaning of the verification time is completely irrelevant, as opposed to we're using now instead of the time specified in the property. And we could solve the latter with docs, but
So that latter one is a new property we've added recently as well, or that's
the verification
Yes.
time ignored was added in the same.
gotcha.
So it's maybe we can come up with a better name than that, or we just say it's a docs problem, and then that validation policy. To summarize Steve's, I think it's validation is implied, and it should either be chain policy or certificate chain policy.
Yeah, and what validation I was sort of implied, and if you drop validation and you just have policy, why is that specific to X509 chains?
Yeah. So I will assert rename validation policy to certificate chain policy.
I'm fine with that. Is there a reason? I didn't read your comment, Jeremy. Is there a reason certificate is better than X509, or?
So there's an existing property for the, if you don't specify this, how does revocation work? And the name of the type of the property is X509 revocation mode, and the name of the property is certificate revocation mode. There's also the word check thrown in there, but
That's fine if it makes sense, and you know what you're talking about here. So
yeah. So I just went with in the existing property on this type for revocation, X509 got changed to certificate. So that's why I proposed that same local consistency change.
fine by me.
Fine was me.
All right. Does anybody have suggestions for verification time ignored, or do we just solve that in docs?
I don't. For memories, we talk about using sentinel value, and we decided to add explicit property to know whether time was set or not. And this property should convey that, essentially, right, Jeremy?
Right. It's if this is true, when you call chain.build is the time we use for verification time, and if it's false, then we use whatever the verification time property says.
Could we remove the ignored and say default or now or something like that?
I just can't think of a way to work it into the name of a property. Because, I mean, the property is valid. We're ignoring the verification time property. We're just not ignoring the verification time concept. But I don't have a... I understand and appreciate the concern that got raised, but I don't have a better name for it. You're still with us, Emo?
I am. I kind of agree with everything that we see on screen right now, so...
Well, at some point the share had kind of grayed out, and I hadn't heard from you since, so
Oh,
I thought you might have stalled.
hopefully the chair is still working. If I select text, does it show up?
Yes.
Okay, so...
All right. I don't hear any suggestions for how to rename it, so...
So keep it and basically rename the property as you suggested. That seems reasonable.
rename
Thank you, guys.
the validation policy to
Right.
certificate chain policy.
Yep. Do you want me to post a comment here and then...
I mean, we can just fix it in the PR, or you can post the comment just so...
Yeah, I think PR is fine.
Okay.
All right, so then close this one, and now we're back to the rate limiter, right? Assuming Brandon is with us on the call, but I think he is, right?
I'm here.
Do you have preferences for order?
I think this is fine. I don't remember what the other one was.
Sounds good.
Super
Oh,
important.
now I do. Okay, yeah. No, this one's fine.
Don't worry, I remember.
Yeah, so basically, when we were showing the partition rate limiter stuff to some folks, they were kind of confused by the create name in the partitions, and thinking that it implied that we were creating the limiter every single time, which we're not. So basically, we want to try to rename it to make it clearer that we're not creating a rate limiter every time. And so one of the suggestions was define. Others I listed down below in the alternate was like choose, get or create. I think I had a couple other suggestions.
My argument is for choose instead of define, because this gets called per call to acquire. And with a name like define, I think it still leads people to think that this is called once per thing you quote unquote define, or per key that you quote unquote define, and that's just not true. It's called like every single time acquire is called, if that's what you're choosing. A way to think about it, and what the reason one of the alternative suggestions was called get or create is like a little bit like, you know, concurrent dictionary get or add. The difference is that the partition rate limiter .create basically defines what the keys are, right? So if ASP.NET's request middleware is calling partition rate limiter .acquire, it's going to just pass in the HTTP context, right? And that's not like a key in the way concurrent dictionary would have a key or something. So the API isn't exactly like concurrent dictionary, but there are some analogies in that basically this callback is getting called every time you try to retrieve a value. Yeah, it's not one-to-one. But yeah, so basically, yeah, I vote for choose. It's kind of complicated. I'm trying to make analogies to concurrent dictionary. It's not exactly the same, but kind of similar.
Why not just get?
Because it's returning the thing that's it's kind of returning a key, and not getting a key. It's a thing that you return from a callback. So rate limit partition isn't referencing like any data. So calling get on it is kind of weird.
Well, I mean, I'm just asking because to me, get kind of doesn't mean that you create something, right? Get can mean get or create usually, right? To me, anything else when you have like create, define, choose is like, I don't know, like to me they all seem equally like ambiguous. Like honestly, choose is the weirdest one from those because I don't even know what that would mean.
At least it doesn't give people like a false sense of what it's doing though. Because I mean, that's really the problem with create is like people see that and they're like, oh, every time I'm calling this, a partition is being created or a rate limiter is being created.
So that one I can understand.
I would argue define has the same problem. Just
yeah,
less.
I would agree with that. But to me, create and define are kind of synonyms. In that sense, that's why I was suggesting get because it's a standard name we have usually. And like, I don't know, like you ask for, let's say, a get concurrency limiter and you get back a rate limit partition. Yeah, I'm not sure that's necessarily useful, but I guess that's...
I mean, could you combine get with partition at the end?
I mean, it's on rate limit partition. Like you have to write out rate limit partition .get. Honestly, like I'm coming around to it. Like it's a little odd that it's a thing you're returning and it's not actually like, you know, a method on a collection, but still. I could get behind get. I think it is better than define.
I mean, I remember vaguely that we designed this to be kind of a factory, right, of sorts, where you can basically discover all the different ways you can partition it, right? So it's So in that sense, I understand the problem that you don't want to give the impression that you create every single time, but yeah, I mean, I guess the names kind of were meant to be like, okay, this is the thing you get back, right? It just seems weird that we have the name is concurrency limiter, but what you get back is a rate limit partition, right? So but I guess that's just the inheritance hierarchy that we have.
I honestly, I might prefer get or create over get. Like Chris Ross on our team was the one who suggested that, and he made the analogy to initially to concurrent dictionary. And yeah, while it's not exact, I think it gives people a better idea of what's going on than create or define.
Yeah, I would agree that create or define to me implies it gets created every single time. Get, I would generally assume it doesn't. So in that sense, to me, get or create is a bit redundant. But that's up to you mostly. I mean, I would probably not go with get or create purely because you already have fairly long names here, and it just makes it even longer. But
yup.
To me, it would also be workable.
Yeah, I feel like get, because it's on rate limit partition, kind of implies that you're not getting the limiter directly, like you're not creating it, right? So get does seem better.
All right, I vote for get.
All right, so then just get it is. Unless I messed it up,
So
that's what we have.
So then it's, yeah, I mean, it does seem a little weird that, get token bucket limiter. I wonder if everything other than the first one should be get for or get with.
Yeah, I was
But
thinking for
maybe I don't care.
get
maybe
for
it's-
makes sense for the first one, but then the other ones are like reading like Yoda, right?
No, I don't like adding prepositions to it. I think get token bucket rate limiter is fine.
Yeah, maybe the return type doesn't matter, right? Maybe when you assign it to a variable and you've worked with the thing, maybe that looks reasonable. I mean, that's I think how we got here in the first place. So maybe we're just overthinking it based on the return type.
I mean, I guess, but like get concurrency limiter does sound like it returns a concurrency limiter, and it doesn't. But
yeah,
I mean,
Maybe
that's my
maybe it looks
objection
alright.
over it not being on a collection, but it causes the thing it's returning to get a concurrency limiter. Like, how wordy are we going to make these methods? Like, eventually we just have to be like, if you know the system, it makes some sense.
All right, so then let's go with that. All right, the other one.
Yeah, so this one, we basically want to rename wait async to acquire async. It kind of goes more in line with what something like channels has, where it's try read versus read async. Wait async doesn't really imply that you get like the lease afterwards, at least in my opinion. So yeah, kind of just a simple rename.
Question though, I can call acquire async, right?
Yep.
And then check the rate limit lease, and is acquired can be false.
Yes.
Like, that's my only thing with it, right? Because with the sync one, the sync one doesn't block, right? It just immediately tries to do the thing.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, I mean, I guess it's the same thing though. That's the only thing that's kind of weird about it, is like you can have acquire async not throw and it's not acquired, but
I mean, I think
Wait,
that
that's-
issue, that's a real issue. It exists regardless of what it's named, unless it was something about it being an attempt.
Like try acquire async that returned a lease that then had false.
Right. As for precedent, I mean, semaphore slim is wait async, and it's upon successful completion, it is taking resource from the instance. So
What's
I think
the
there's-
synchronous method for that?
wait.
Right. So I mean, it's wait and wait async, right? Versus acquire and then wait async.
Wait, there's a space synchronous method on rate limiter.
Oh yeah, I should have included it here to compare. Sorry.
But that doesn't block. You can see it in
Sure.
the API usage, actually. You
Oh,
can call it
yeah.
before the if.
Scroll down.
Wait, so
Okay,
they do or do not do the same thing, one of which is just an asynchronous version of the other.
They
not
do slightly different things. Yeah,
So naming them the same then is actually an issue.
Yeah,
I see.
that was kind of what I was getting at. Like at first, I was thinking the difference was in terms of the acquiredness of the lease, but that isn't the difference. The difference is like acquire async will try harder basically to actually acquire a lease. It will wait around, but even then, it's not guaranteed.
So if I'm understanding correctly, acquire returns immediately and tells you whether it was successful or not as part of the returned thing. The
Yep.
proposed acquire async will wait until either it's successful or the cancellation token has cancellation requested.
Or
Mostly.
a limiter puts you over a limit where it's like don't even wait. So it can still be is acquired false after you wait, which is fun.
Yeah, naming them the same, I think, regardless of what names we pick for the synchronous and asynchronous methods, they are not counterparts to each other. So either we need to make them counterparts, in which case they should have the same prefix, or they should use different names.
I agree with that.
Yeah, that makes sense.
So then I guess the original name is better.
It kind of is.
Yeah.
Like at least you convey the notion that you are waiting. Doesn't mean it's successful, but hey.
Again, it's kind of these nuanced behaviors of the system where you loved if it was just you could describe it all in the method name.
I mean, you could also have acquire and wait, right? In which case there's at least some notion that there's a difference, but I don't know what you want to convey here. Like it seems like you carefully pick the semantics you currently have and now we try to name them, and maybe that's just
Pretty much.
like, I mean, this is the other thing, right? If the name is not 100% right, but it's in the vicinity, right? Either name would also be okay, right? It's a
Yeah, and like it's on a rate limiter, so like what else are you waiting on other than like the resources at least?
I would be fine with wait async. I'd be fine with wait and acquire async. I just don't want them to be named the same if they're not, since people expect that they can flip back and forth between, and tooling analyzers expect that you can flip back and forth between sync and async based on your context.
yeah, that's a good point. They should not have the same base name. That is very true. Do you have a preference for wait and acquire or acquire and wait?
I have a
wait async.
preference for them happening in the order that they happen. So wait and acquire. If we're going to have a conjoint name like that, wait and acquire, since you're basically waiting and then acquiring, since the synchronous acquire is an instantaneous operation that happens at the end of however much waiting you want to do.
Gotcha. That makes sense. Yeah.
I don't think we should change the name now. Like I think you make a good point that we can't name it the same thing if behavior is different. And because of that, I honestly think the old name is better than the conjoined thing. What do you think, Brennan?
I mean, yeah, I mean, I agree with all the arguments. It's just wait async isn't the best name, which is annoying. I don't have
so
a good
do you
suggestion.
prefer wait and acquire async?
Kind of, actually. Because it, at least in the name implies that you're getting like the least thing back. Whereas wait async, like technically it could just be a task and you wait. Like wait to read async and channel, I could equate the wait async to. Where you wait and then you call acquire or something. But that's not what wait async is doing. So the wait and acquire implies that you're waiting and then getting the least back.
Okay, and permit count has a default value, so it could be reasonably misinterpreted. I see that.
Yes.
And I think we've had this conversation before, but the operation does need to be atomic, right? Like you want it to be not just wait until we might be successful and then call acquire in a loop. You actually want it to be an atomic operation where you wait and the result is the acquisition.
Yes.
Yeah.
Can I sneak one more small change in this API review? I want to rename resource ID parameters to resource. There's no reason ID on any of these partition rate limiter APIs should be in that parameter name. Typically, like in the ASP.NET middleware that uses it, like the resource is HTTP context. That is in no sense an ID. It's just a bad name. The ID is kind of extracted from the resource later.
So is this the only places where we refer to ID? If not,
no, I want like a blanket grant to rename resource ID parameters to resource.
Any of the types or methods on partition rate limiter have resource ID when they take a resource. So there's like 3 or 4 methods.
I mean, I'm happy to approve it if somebody gives me a list of all the places. But yeah.
I'll try.
So then I guess this one we can reject, right? And then we can have a secondary one where we just approve the other APIs. We can also do this over email. It doesn't have to be now. I just want to have somewhat of a paper trail for those things. Otherwise, we are wondering why this happened.
I thought we wanted to wait and acquire.
Oh, okay.
Oh, yeah.
Okay, that's fair enough. Yeah. Wait and acquire, is that the name?
Wait and acquire async.
Yep. Sorry. Yeah, that's what I meant. Alright, wait and acquire async. So that would be, here we go. Happy with that then?
Yeah.
All right, then let's do this. Can't believe we still have some time left. I guess then we can look at binary integer after all. Is Tanner on the call? He is.
Nope, I'm not here at all. So when we reviewed IBinaryInteger originally with the write and try-write APIs, we had discussed briefly the having read equivalents and said we didn't believe there was a concrete scenario yet, and we were going to wait for more feedback from users and add them in the future if that arose. And of course, the week before the weekend before Code Complete, someone opened an issue requesting we expose the read APIs. So here it is. They're basically direct inverses from the write APIs. So there's read big Indian, read little Indian, and then try read and try read big and little Indian. They take in the standard set of parameters, so a span being the source, or a byte array plus index for the source, and then they also take in a parameter is unsigned, which is the same parameter taken by the corresponding API, existing APIs in big integer, that indicates whether the byte array represents a signed or unsigned 2's complement number, which determines how you interpret the most significant bit.
Did we keep the unsigned on writes?
No, we did not. The write APIs just write the value as signed or unsigned, and you have a separate property on the on all number types that indicates whether it's a signed or unsigned number.
Because I remember at least being personally upset with the is unsigned and is big Indian on big integer, but I don't remember why. So I was gonna say we should match whatever we did for write, but if we don't have it on write, then it's
then
I guess I'm a little confused as to why we have it on read if we don't have it on write.
Well, so when you're writing, you have the original value, and so you're able to determine is that value positive, negative, and is it a signed or unsigned number. When you are reading, all you're getting is a span, and so -1 and uint.max value, for example, will be the same byte it will be the same sequence of 4 bytes.
Yeah, that makes sense.
And so when reading, so when writing, you have data available that allows you to determine what the bits were and how to interpret them. But when reading, you need to also be passed how to interpret the bits.
Right.
I would have assumed that if the argument was that it was that you have the type already and you can ask the type if it's signed, then if that applied to write, it would apply to read. Like I'm good with the option. I'm just confused by the asymmetry.
Well, for big integer, when you set up big integer, you had to make a decision between do you write an unsigned value as signed with an extra byte or not. So if you have a unsigned value and you say write as signed, you may need an extra byte to represent it. Which
is why I don't know why we didn't have the option on write.
Because write just writes the value as the 2's complement representation. So for int, it will always write 4 bytes. For big integer, it writes the shortest sequence of 2's complement representation that fits in a multiple of 4 bytes.
I guess if you're going to a span destination, unsigned write would be if it's negative, then ask for 1 more byte than I actually need and tell it to start writing at position 1. So that you get your padding 0 in your answer. But if we have an array returning 1, then now you have to do array resize.
Yeah.
Which was why we added the option on big integer so that we could stop doing array resizes to insert the padding bytes.
Right, and the way that it's set up for write is that there is no padding byte needed.
Unless there is. Just because big integer is the source doesn't mean the destination understands signed types. Big integers is the only number that we have that's bigger than 64 or 128 bits.
Right, but it also always writes as the shortest two's complement representation that fits in a multiple of 4 bytes. So a 96-bit number will be 12 bytes big, no matter whether
Fair.
it's signed or unsigned. And then you get the additional data of, do I interpret it as signed or unsigned via the is unsigned property. Or is positive, rather.
I guess, did we make write only write to spans, or did we make one that returns an array?
No, it writes to an array. There is none that returns an array.
Okay, so that's how we solve the problem, is you just make the array big enough before you call it.
And there's an API that tells you exactly how many bytes you need.
Yeah. Okay, and so here, this is read the value as big Indian, and I'm telling you it came from a source that believed it was unsigned, so deal with that as appropriate.
Right. And so it will, in the worst case, have to, like, let's say that you are reading a 8-bit value. You've got a source that is 8 bytes long, and you're reading that into an int32. The worst case scenario is you have to process up to 4 additional bytes to determine if they're all 0, or all bits set. That way you know it's a fits a fits negative or fits signed value.
So should this be Boolean or nullable Boolean, where null is I got it from your read, or I got it from your write, do whatever you think the right answer is, and specified would mean that you know that it's supposed to be assigned or know that it's supposed to be an unsigned value?
I think it should just be bool, and the user should always specify whether it's signed or unsigned. Otherwise, you get ambiguous handling for certain values for signed types.
Okay.
Because like if big integer has a 4-byte sequence that is FF, then that could either be -1 or uint.max value. And it has to know if it's signed or unsigned to know how to interpret it. And long is technically the same way.
Yeah. So ulong, if is unsigned is false, and the high bit is set, it's gonna throw?
Yeah, it will have to throw a overflow exception.
Okay. And I remembered now, I didn't like the is unsigned on write, because is describing the input data, so it makes sense here. But we also had added it on write on the big integer, and that's where it was like, okay, reading this now, it no longer makes sense. So disregard my dislike for the is.
Tanner, at the beginning of the discussion, you mentioned we had said we would consider implementing these in the future if we ever got feedback. Does that mean there's the possibility of a default implementation for these, or you put them on a different interface, or what were you thinking for those?
We would have had to. So the default implementation, if anything, would have had to have been something like read this as a big integer and then call create from big integer. It wouldn't have been efficient, but it would have worked.
I see. It would also be challenging without moving big integer down into core lib, I guess.
Yeah, but that's not a huge concern overall. We already have like 2 different big integer implementations internally in core lib, and theoretically moving our big integer down after we do the planned rewrite would allow us to remove those additional implementations we have in core lib anyways.
Sounds like something we should consider anyway.
Yep. Just not for 7.
So
And are we doing the array with a start index consistently throughout the space here?
Yeah, we've got byte source or destination, byte array source or destination, and then int start index as the second parameter.
Should we dim all of the array ones into the span ones?
Yes, and that's actually how write's implemented.
Okay, so the numeric types will have to write 3 methods, the span ones, and if they for some reason want to handle the array one specially, they can. But
4 methods total. Try read big. Try
because the bottom 2 aren't an overload group. Okay.
Right, and then try read for big and little, and then try write for big and little. So they have to implement 4 total to support reading and writing.
Actually, couldn't the non-tries be written in terms of the tries as well?
Right,
so
right.
They
That's
should
what
only
I
have to
was
do
saying.
2.
Well, they've got try read and try write.
Oh, but from this new proposal, so the top
it's
6
just 2.
things are all dimmed one way or another, but they have to actually write the bottom 2.
Right.
Okay. Yeah, that's fine. It avoids overload explosion on the part of the implementations.
Yeah.
Can you explain the is unsigned one more time? I don't think I fully got it.
So int 32 -1 and uint 32 max value are represented by the same bit sequence. And so you have to have is unsigned to determine should the source be interpreted as a signed 2's complement number or an unsigned 2's complement number.
But isn't the type that's implementing the interface?
No,
Knowing that?
because you could, for example, have you could have an int 32, the most common type in .NET, which is positive, be read by something like a long or a ulong, and you still want to know was the value originally positive or negative. That way, negative value should be ignored. Because let's say you had an int 32 and then you wrote it, you had -1 as an int 32, you wrote out the byte sequence for it into a destination, and then you immediately did ulong.read. If you don't specify is unsigned,
I only wrote 4 bytes on that first one, right?
Yeah.
And ulong.read is going to read 8 bytes.
No, it reads the source as a 2's complement number.
So
This isn't like
basically sign
binary
extended.
primitives. Right. This isn't like binary primitives, which just reads the first 4 bytes from the input and interprets the bytes literally as the destination type. This is interpreting the source as an actual number.
Why isn't it like binary primitives?
Because that doesn't work for big integer, for complex, or other number types. And you also, binary primitives has really weird behavior if you are trying to do things like if you've got a source number type and a destination number type. You're also working in a generic context generally, so you've got a T source and a T destination where you don't know what the input and the outputs are.
How do I know what to pass into this bool as the call?
Generally, it will be the output of a write, of some other write.
I mean, basically, if you're reading from a data file, the spec says if it was a signed or unsigned number. If you've converted it from some other numeric type, it's what type you converted it from. So it's the problem of you have bytes and you need to tell the read what you thought the bytes represented.
And so when I pass false into this, and I'm calling like uint, read big or read little endian, whatever, what happens then? It throws?
So if
If-
you're, go ahead, Jeremy.
If the sign bit is set.
But I passed in that this is not unsigned.
Right. So
it's-
it's signed. So if for little endian, if the last byte has the high bit set, then now the uint will say I can't read this because it represents a negative number.
Mhm.
But if the most significant bit for your endianness is clear, then the unsigned types won't throw because it's a signed value that was castable. So it changes the boundary conditions on the overflow exception.
Right.
Okay, I guess I don't get how this is going to be usable. Like even in the API usage, it doesn't have like this. So, but if I'm not going to object, it's just it seems.
Yeah, the expected input of this API is the output of a binary integer .write command.
I would expect the expected input of this to be some file or some stream of some sort that I got from somewhere.
If we had some API that could read, that was like a binary reader, then it would have to be a much more complex shape, and it wouldn't be a counterpart to what write does.
So I guess my confusion with this is, isn't the parameter effectively a function of the type?
It's a function of it's an additional parameter of source. It describes how source is laid out, not how the T self is going to interpret it.
Yeah, I guess my assumption is if the type you're invoking it on is a signed type, then it would always pass false, and if it is a signed type, then it was always the other way around. It would always pass true, and otherwise it would always pass false. And you're saying that's not true?
I'm saying that it is source unsigned.
Yeah, I guess then
It's describing the signedness of the source, not of the destination, not of the result.
Yeah, I guess I'm kind of with Eric on the sense like, how would I know this?
Because it's supposed to be passed in alongside source. So the usage scenario is you have some T where T is binary integer, you call write, and then you pass in the destination span that it wrote to along with T along with value is negative, for example. Value is positive in this case. And then everything just flows.
So, I mean, who's implementing IBinaryInteger? It's like big decimal. Is it the only one that we have?
Big integer
So big
and
integer.
all of the integral types. So byte, s byte, short, u short, int, uint, long, u long, int, inuint, int 128, and uint 128.
So basically all
If we didn't have to worry about big integer, would we need this parameter?
Yes.
So that's the part
Why?
I don't understand, because I mean, if I'm reading an unsigned int, then I would always pass in true, and if I read an int, I would always pass false. No?
How do you know that you're reading an unsigned int?
Well, because I invoke it on the type, right? No?
Right, you're trying to read an unsigned int from a 2's complement number represented as a sequence of bytes. But how do you know whether that 2's complement number represented as a sequence of bytes is itself signed or unsigned? Otherwise, you end up writing -1, reading it as a uint, and interpreting it as max value. So you do a truncation cast rather than an overflow cast.
I think I finally understand what you're saying. You're basically saying, like, yes, your type might be unsigned, but you might still read from a signed source.
Right.
Yeah, the is unsigned is
I see.
The value you called write on, was that signed or unsigned?
We could call this is source unsigned, if that helps clarify.
Yeah, maybe, but I think that I mean, I kind of assumed it was a function of the type, but like I guess, yeah, I guess it's really a format question, right? Which is not like you need to don't. Basically, the answer is there's no way to read this from the byte array. You just have to intrinsically know. So it's a function of your protocol. So it's either signed or unsigned, and you have to know.
Right, because the ultimate issue is that you need to either understand this as a function of truncation or a function of conversion. And when you have an arbitrary sequence of bytes, especially if this is the inverse of write, then you have a function of conversion, not a function of truncation. So you're not reading in int 32. You are functionally trying to read a 2's complement number and convert it to whatever your target type is.
So I guess if you ignore big integer for a second, right? Like normally you could say you don't have this parameter. Like if you know the underlying source is, let's say, signed, then you would read in 32, read blah, blah, blah. And then if you needed an unsigned one, well, then it's up to you to convert the signed integer you just got into an unsigned representation, right?
Right, but you're going to have a sequence of bytes, so you'll still need to know, is it unsigned or signed, so you know how to do that.
Yes, but I mean, I'm saying that based on that knowledge, you basically either parse it as an int32 or you parse it as a uint, right? Like if it's a 32-bit number, right? So like basically you just change the type you're invoking the read method on, and then you handle the conversion later yourself, rather than having this is a parameter that is built into the read API.
Yeah, but so the issue is that all of this isn't actually on concrete types. This isn't on an int or a uint. This is on a t and a u that are constrained to ibinary integer. You don't know what that t and the u are because you don't know the concrete type. You only have a generic type.
Fair enough. Yes, that is true.
But somebody told you that type though, right? Somebody called process data of int.
Yeah, but it's not
Sure.
about the type, right? It's really about it's about the, so let's say you parse a protocol, right? I don't know, like something, right? You need to know what the layout of the protocol is, in the same way that you need to know that, okay, they have a 4-bit number here. Is this stored as a 32-bit unsigned int, or is it stored as a 32-bit signed int, right? So that's something you just intrinsically know about the format. And if you don't know that, well, then you can't read the format, right? That's the...
Right. And if you're writing a generic method, then you're never going to know the concrete type. Some other user could specify what those concrete types are, but the method that's actually calling read and write won't know. It's just going to have a t and a u.
Yeah, so that makes sense to me now. Okay, I think I got it. Eric doesn't seem like he's convinced yet.
I guess I would have thought this was just the generic, if you will, wrapper over top of binary primitives. So that way I didn't have to call binary primitives.readInt32 and have this big switch statement on my type. I can just be like, well, the t is an ibinary integer, so now I can just call read little endian or read big endian, and I don't have to do the switch on all the binary primitive types.
You can use this like that if you specify is unsigned as the signedness of the target type.
Yeah, exactly.
So if you wanted to use this like binary primitives, you would say source, and you would pass is unsigned as t self is I unsigned number. And if you wanted to use it as the conversion like, then you end up having to say is unsigned as the source signedness, which is the normal use case for it.
Right.
As an inverse of write. Because all is unsigned is doing is saying, how do I determine overflow on this input?
Right.
And if you lie about it, then it just works like truncation. Because it becomes a bitwise reinterpretation.
casting is a form of lying. Does it make sense, Eric? You're still very silent.
I get it now a little bit more. It still feels like people who are going to walk up to this API isn't going to understand this. Maybe renaming it would help a little bit. I mean, there's no docs here either, so when we actually doc this, it'll be explained.
Yeah, the actual doc I've got describes read source as a 2's complement number in little or big Indian format and converts to an instance of T-self.
I mean, could we have an overload that basically does the forwarding that you suggested?
You mean like default is unsigned to, or don't specify is unsigned at all, and have that overload basically be T-self is I unsigned number?
Yeah, so basically you get the same signedness as the type you're invoking it on. So if you want a conversion, then you have to specify it. If you don't want a conversion, then you just assume it's the same on both sides.
I'm not sure if that's going to be any more clear. I think maybe if we're going to do something, we'd rename this from read to something like read number big Indian, and maybe something like read bits big Indian.
I mean, at that point, it's the same as the binary primitive, right? Where the kind of the unsignedness is coming from the type you're trying to read, right? So in that sense, it's clearer because it's kind of like you only pass in the source and the start index, so there's only so many ways you can screw up.
It's less clear because then you have two overloads that have completely differing semantics. You don't have is unsigned being treated as a default. You have it being treated as a distinct value separate separate from the intended use.
I'm not sure I follow. Like, I mean, you're basically just saying it is defaulted based on what your type is, right?
Right, which isn't normally expressible. So rather than having, so the expected use case of is unsigned here is that it is source unsigned. You pass in the signedness of the source, whereas you're saying expose an overload that takes byte array source with the same name that treats it as is T-self unsigned rather than is source unsigned. So It becomes a different parameter. And overloading names where the two APIs have different semantics like that doesn't seem good.
But they don't have different semantics, right? It just means that you default the value based on some condition, right? So it is. I mean, that's all it is, right?
Well, it's one is source unsigned and one is T-self unsigned.
No.
Yes.
No, the one without is unsigned means T-self and source are both the same.
Exactly.
It means that so you're saying that we have T-self read big endian byte array source, and there is no bool parameter on it, but that bool parameter is effectively bool is T-self unsigned. It's an implicit bit of metadata there, whereas the one that takes a bool is explicitly is source unsigned. It's how to interpret the source bytes. And so you have bools that have different semantics there logically.
I don't think they're different semantics. You're basically just saying the parameter logically represents what the assignedness of the source is, and the overload just says assume it's the same as the target type. That's all it says, right? So you're basically saying, like, you know, that you're basically just choosing how to propagate that value or how to populate that value. So to me, it's kind of like within the realm of what overloads do.
Maybe. I'm not convinced, but I won't push back against it.
Like, I mean, if you want to simplify, then having a differently named method group, in my opinion, just makes it more complicated. And I think that, like, if the normal case is that, which I assume it is because that's how the normal binary primitives work, is that we assume the signedness of the type you're invoking it for, right? And we would just have the same semantics here, by also giving you the ability to do the conversion, because you can't easily switch between types in a generic context, right? So that to me makes sense as well. But I mean, yeah, I mean, I have a bit trouble like imagining what generic code would look like, because clearly when I'm reading a protocol, I kind of have to know the types at that point. So it would be a bit of a complication. So maybe in the generic context, you never really know the types. So maybe you just make is unsigned just a parameter to your generic algorithm, and then it's just somebody else's problem to figure that out. So in that sense, I'm not sure I fully have an opinion. What does Jeremy think?
I think it's fine as proposed. It's expressive, and any defaulting, I mean, that's where I asked the nullable question, and I feel that Tanner convinced me it just gets weird. So, and
it basically becomes, with the current API, you normally pass in source is positive, and then if you really want to interpret it, just reinterpret the bits, then you can lie and just say T self is ion sign number, and that will end up basically saying treat this number as whatever the destination type is, regardless of what the source type was.
And saying that it's like the binary primitives where it chunks the exact data loses a few scenarios, like you wrote a long that fit into a byte, and now you interpret it in byte, assuming that byte's a number. But let's just say you wrote a long that would fit into a short, and now you read it as short. It gets to look at all those surplus zeros and be like, oh, the value fit. As opposed to, your data's too long, it's probably not mine.
Yeah,
so.
And there's also the whole issue that binary primitives has, in that it interprets it as an array of bytes where you're supposed to read the next X bytes and then increment the counter. And so if you had a long in big Indian format and you were trying to read a short in little Indian format, you actually have to know that you need to increment by 6, then read, and then increment 2 more.
Yeah, it's fine.
It gets like, binary primitives itself isn't a very well designed API for some scenarios. It's a primitive, but it's not extensible to generic context or anything like that.
Yeah, there may be some oddities with the color, and I don't know if, Emo, you want to note that the top 6 are all actually dimmed. Yeah, it may create for a few odd scenarios, or where callers feel it's weird, like we've discussed, but I think it's probably the right level of expressiveness to complete the space.
Aren't they then technically virtual, not abstract, if they're dimmed?
Yeah, they'd be virtual and
virtual arrow ...
Yeah.
Yeah, there's some implementation behind that, but that's, I don't care what that is. It just means you don't have to implement it. All right, then that's it, I guess. Alrighty. Now it's 12:08. And except for wind phones, we've done them all today. Yay!
So
I'll figure out the scheduling with Klaus, and then hopefully this was the last big one, right? Quick. So I guess we could squeeze in Klaus on Thursday.
And then I guess I'm up after him.
And then there's like yeah, it seems like WPF might actually want to do a review, right, based on the meeting we had with them, but that seems small-ish, right? It's probably just the one dialogue they want to do, So how big can that be?
I also don't know that they're ready. I think they were trying to learn what the process would be so they knew how to get from where
Yeah,
they
that's fair.
are to the point where they could bring it into a review.
That is fair. Yep, that is also true.
Because their issue is a community proposal, not an internal proposal.
Yep.
And so I don't think they've even done the work of reshaping it themselves. So
Yeah, fair enough. All right, so then see you guys on Thursday then. Enjoy.
Auf Wiedersehen.
Sounds good. Bye, everybody.
Bye-bye.